Hello and welcome. Vanished without a trace. What happens to the tens of thousands of people who are secretly imprisoned and sometimes killed around the world? Often their families never learn the truth of how or why their loved ones were taken away. So why hasn't more been done to tackle this? August 30th marks International Day of the Disappeared to highlight the fate of these people and to encourage protection for those at risk. From Latin America to Asia, illegal tactics are being used by governments and other groups to quickly take down their opponents. Furthermore, the UN estimates the number of men, women and children being seized illegally is growing worldwide. So on today's show we ask, what's being done to end enforced disappearances and what will it take to reach truth and reconciliation in such cases? Join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can call into the show or send us a text message or an email. With me to discuss the issues is Pierre Kruijnbuhl, who is Director of Operations for the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is using the Day of the Disappeared to highlight ongoing cases of forced disappearances. He's joining us from Geneva. And from New York we have Eduardo Gonzalez, a sociologist and Director of the Truth-Seeking Program with the International Center for Transitional Justice. Mr. Gonzalez helped Peru carry out its Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the program. Pierre Kruijnbuhl, if I could start with you and ask how you define the disappeared, because for many people, I think, especially in parts of the developed world, there's confusion between what is disappeared and perhaps simply missing.
Well, yes, good evening. In the ICRC's experience, there are many ways of going missing in a situation of armed conflict. In fact, there can be a situation where a bomb explodes and somebody is killed in the explosion. Nobody collects the body, and therefore a family remains with the uncertainty around what has happened and potentially without news for many, many years. But in the case of enforced disappearance, what we're talking about is indeed a situation of arrest, detention or abduction by representatives of a state or people acting on behalf of the state, and later the concealment and the refusal to acknowledge that this person is detained and therefore beyond the reach of the law. And that means that people remain, in fact, they're also without certainty about the fate or whereabouts of a loved one.
Let me ask you one thing now. Is there a common profile of those affected? Is there something that is common when it comes to looking at those disappeared around the world? Is there a common trend?
Well, it really, in our experience, again, depends very much on the nature of the situation of armed conflict that we're dealing with or the situation of violence. I personally experienced this situation in the Balkans, very close at hand with, of course, at times accidental situations of disappearance, but in many instances the deliberate intention by one of the parties to a conflict to have somebody arrested and then disappear without a trace, leaving many, many thousands of families. In fact, in our statistics, over 34,000 throughout the former Yugoslavia without news. We have many instances in Latin America, in Afghanistan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So in many cases, I think it is simply one ethnic group against another, but it can be also deeply politically motivated and can be, as I said earlier, the result of simply somebody getting caught up in an explosion and never being traced again.
Well, let me ask Eduardo Gonzalez, welcome you to the show as well, sir. How easy is it for you in your work, especially with truth and reconciliation, to define people who have disappeared? How can you distinguish them from those who have gone missing perhaps as a result of conflict or simply run away because of that conflict or trauma that's been experienced?
Thank you for the question, Riz. The difference is perhaps what my colleague has just mentioned. The missing are situations that happen in almost every conflict. A conflict is a chaotic situation, and you have people, for example, that get displaced and lose contact with their family for a long period of time, or combatants who are killed and their bodies are not retrieved from the battlefield. Think of, for example, an aviator whose plane falls. However, a forced disappearance is a crime. Is a kidnapping actually taken by a government, an authority, that is followed by the refusal to acknowledge that that kidnapping took place. So what happens here is that some authorities are actually taking down opponents, but not just killing those opponents, but also sowing fear, uncertainty, and terror in their families and in their communities, but not recognizing what has happened to the people. So we are facing a crime that is particularly cruel because it's not just the arbitrary execution of a person that happens in front of everyone, striking fear and certainly taking out an opponent. But this is something that shows uncertainty and terrifies a family and produces horrendous wounds in the psyche of entire communities.
I'll ask you more about that, Eduardo, but let me ask you about the origins of this phenomenon, because I gather there's a dark history. It dates back to the Nazis, doesn't it?
In fact, the Nazis at Nuremberg were judged, among other things, because of the practice of disappearances. During their occupation of Soviet Russia, the Germans signed decrees authorizing the execution of partisans, Russian resistors, and authorizing also not to inform the families and the communities of those people that they had been executed or what happened to their bodies. And the explicit intention of this kind of practice was to demoralize what the Nazis considered their adversaries. That practice, which is incredibly cruel, of course, was taken in full force by the military dictatorships in Latin America. As you know, and the public certainly does too, the military dictatorship in Argentina, for example, practiced the disappearance of opponents in a widespread form, affecting, according to estimates of the Argentinian sources, about 30,000 people.
Now, Pierre Crenville, let me ask you about the getting the exact figures or getting some real idea of how many people have disappeared. Considering in many conflict situations there's so much confusion, as we were discussing earlier, is it possible to get precise figures on how many people really have become the disappeared, so to speak?
Well, there's certainly no worldwide consolidated figures because in many instances there's a lot of precisely concealment and lack of information made available around these particular tragic instances. But there are concrete examples that I can give. Working in my experience, certainly regarding also Peru, there after 2 decades of war, Eduardo knows that situation much closer, even 15,000 missing persons have been reported that certainly we are aware of. Again, I said earlier in the situation of the former Yugoslavia, throughout the 10 years of war in that region, 34,000 people missing from that. Throughout the different conflicts in the Middle East, if you take the Iran-Iraq war from the early 80s, to the second half of the 80s, the Gulf War in the early 90s, and then in addition, the resulting situation from the US-led invasion of 2003, there are literally tens of thousands of people who still remain unaccounted for from those different phases. And I can even give an example of the Red Cross of the Russian Federation that we work closely with and continues to receive annually over 25,000 requests from people that refer back to World War II. So I think what's very important for everybody to understand, and also every viewer to understand, is that behind all these statistics are individual destinies. These are men, women, and children whose lives have been torn apart by untold violence and tragedy. And I can remember very, very closely the first time I had a person refer to this in Guatemala many years ago, where a woman said to me, every time somebody knocks on the door, every time the phone rings, I live with the hope that some news will come. And yet, as time passes, there's this lingering uncertainty that sets in, and definitely the great difficulty to turn the page and to overcome the suffering that the families face.
Let me ask you, Eduardo, about the figures that the United Nations is coming out with now suggest that the number of disappeared is actually growing. What is at fault here? Is it a lack of international law? Is it a lack of communication? What's going on?
I think it has to do with the nature of the armed conflicts we are seeing now. You know, in the past, armed conflicts were affairs of professional armies clashing in the battlefield, and therefore the casualties were massive among soldiers. Think of World War I. But of course, now you are seeing more internal armed conflicts, where governments confront different forms of opposition, and sometimes where governments face an outright civil war. And in these situations, governments attack and usually target civilian populations because they suspect that civilian populations harbor their enemies. And sometimes what they do is to target this population to take out people who they consider suspect, and then they do not want to carry with the consequences of executing someone in an extrajudicial manner in front of everyone. So what they do is they kill somebody and then they hide the body and they deny what happened. This is, of course, particularly cruel. And what Pierre in Geneva was mentioning arises many sad memories in my case. I do also remember this kind of testimonies, and I remember, in fact, women in Peru who, after an exhumation and after identifying the bodies of their relatives, were able for the first time to actually wear black, the mourning clothes of a woman in the highlands of Peru, something that they had been unable to do for 20 years because they didn't know whether their husbands and loved ones were alive or dead.
What you say there, Eduardo, gives me a couple of interesting questions to raise, but let me get Nadia back on the line from Norway and see if we have a question from her. Nadia, go ahead.
Yes, hello, Riz.
Nice.
It's Nadia calling from Norway. I just had a question. I thoroughly appreciate you discussing this topic on Al Jazeera. I would like to talk about disappearances in Balochistan, in Pakistan, where about 6,000 Baloch population has been disappeared since 2004, and it's a silent emergency which needs international attention. And these disappeared are the educated, middle class, really student kind of intellectual population which are being disappeared. And it's a kind of a state terror which is being used to silence people. And don't you think the international community, including international organizations like ICRC itself and EU and the US, need to really put pressure on these states?
Okay, Nadia, let me put this to Pierre. I mean, the issues that were being raised. Eduardo had raised the issue of inciting terror in the community. That the idea of the disappeared and the techniques and tactics that are used, they are widespread. In the example given here of Balochistan, in the experiences you've had with the ICRC, does this come at a basically ethnic cleansing in your opinion?
Well, I think, again, if you take these types of situations, and I'm not able at this point to confirm the figures that were announced on Balochistan. I'm not aware of the details of those particular figures. But in any case, whatever the situation is, whether it is in a country like Pakistan or whether it is, again, in neighboring Afghanistan or whether it was during the war in Sri Lanka, whenever we receive an information related to the disappearance of an individual from a given family, the first thing that the ICRC does will be to approach authorities or a given group that we believe responsible for that disappearance and immediately try to ascertain whether this person is held or detained by that authority or that group. Throughout worldwide, the ICRC visits approximately 500,000 persons detained every year in over 75 countries, and those are thousands of places of detention. And the very objective of that and of repeating those visits is to try and locate people who go missing under such circumstances, because we know that it is often a matter of hours or days, and as soon as we are able to link up with a person detained, to register this person and therefore to trace the person and often to re-establish the contact with the family, well, then we have achieved at least one step. And I realize that it's an issue where one has to remain very modest, because there are also indeed many people that we do not reach in those circumstances, which is precisely why our commitment goes on.
Yeah, and actually, Pierre, I should point out also, I wasn't saying that, trying to label what's happening there in Balochistan as ethnic cleansing. I was wondering more if there is a group targeted, whether, for example, ethnic cleansing that does occur in places and has been labeled as such is part of that process that where you get the numbers of disappeared increasing so much.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if we think of examples in situations where you can think of what happened obviously in Rwanda during the period of the genocide, or again what we experienced in the Balkans or at other moments, these were deliberate intentions to have people arrested and at times simply disappear without a trace, in context where the idea is to remove the presence of another community, to remove the presence of another group, and where that particular tactic, as it were, which again, as Eduardo said earlier, amounts to a crime under international humanitarian law or under international human rights law, is applied by a state authority in such circumstances.
All right, well, I'm going to take a very short break here. When we return, we'll look at how truth and reconciliation can be reached in the cases of the disappeared. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The disappeared, people who for various reasons are removed from society, number tens of thousands, if not more. It's hard to get precise figures. Well, August 30th marks International Day of the Disappeared, and explaining what's behind this phenomenon, I have Pierre Crembule, Director of Operations for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Eduardo Gonzalez, Director of the Truth-Seeking Program at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Let's get back to some questions with a call from Virginia, and we have Mona on the line. Mona, go ahead.
Hello, my question is to the representative from the Red Cross, and I'm concerned about what's going on in Somalia. We're getting reports in some of the peaceful areas in Somalia that this tactic has been used by the Puntland intelligence services to intimidate certain clans and displace them. They take certain members of the community, or vocal youth especially, or religious leaders under the Terrorism Act and this climate that we live in today. And they disappear, and everybody knows that's been taken by those forces. And
right.
this
Mona,
is sad.
Mona, let me put this to Pierre and ask, how complicated is your job? Obviously working in a conflict environment in the first instance, and then secondly, as this so-called war on terror became a label for many governments to be able to make moves in the interest of national security, how much has that complicated your work?
Well, Riz, I think the first thing that you mentioned, it is inevitably very difficult to work in any situation of armed conflict, and your caller had the question on Somalia, which is obviously probably one of the most complex environments today to work in because of the level of insecurity, because of the difficulty to have access. But beyond that, I think it is one of the countries where I feel that the population is exposed to so many cumulative effects of the fighting, direct injury, exposure to fighting, multiple displacements. And they're also dealing with consequences of natural calamities, floods, but also drought. And indeed, some of the most dramatic stories that I've ever come to read are Somalis who, in despair, decide to flee across the Gulf and towards Yemen and other countries on the way out of the country, and who go missing simply because at times they are thrown overboard by people who transport them to the other side. And that means many, many people who will never be accounted for under those particular circumstances. So yes, working in these situations is something particularly dramatic. And you referred to then the environment post September 11. Yes, that did add an additional dimension, because came into play the notion at time of secret detention, of hidden places, undisclosed places of detention, cooperation between states in that regard. And for us, it is clear at the ICRC that however legitimate it may be to detain someone, it is unacceptable to do so without having that person duly registered, notified to an organization such as us, but in particular to ensure that a trace remains of the fact that that human being is placed behind bars and interrogated. Again, it is allowed to interrogate, it is allowed to detain, it is allowed to question, but not to have a person disappear without a trace. And that is something that we are struggling and continuing to commit to.
Let's get on the line. Malik from Yemen is back. Go ahead, Malik.
Hi, Riz.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Riz, I'm listening this my respected guest. My concern is why the international community, why the whole international world, the people, the superpower, they wait for this figure of disappeared people to go to from hundreds to the thousands. Why do they wait? When they are seeing that in some places crime is being committed,
Malik,
people are being disappeared.
Right, Malik, let me put this to Eduardo Gonzalez here. Now, of course, there's the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, which was established in 2006, but it hasn't been ratified. It's short of a signature, and it seems that many of the countries, in some cases even involved in setting it up, aren't bothering to sign it. What's the problem there?
Riz and Malik, in fact, what happens is that sometimes governments simply decide to break the law. Sometimes there are governments that decide to rule arbitrarily. We have had a number of military dictatorships or semi-military dictatorships in Latin America that just decided that it was expedient to kill opponents and then deny that they had committed that kind of assassination. And that, of course, makes for a very difficult phenomenon to deal with. A disappearance, by essence, is the kind of crime that is committed in secrecy and belongs in secrecy because the evidence, which is the body, is of course taken out. So it is a very complex crime to deal with, and it's a very complex crime to record. Pierre will know certainly that when you have cases of disappearances, sometimes you have some kind of witness. If not the perpetrators themselves, who may be repentant or who knows, then the community may know some characteristics of what happened. And then based on that patterns, you can investigate around police barracks or army barracks or places where people have in the past found some bodies. In that case, you have to ask the community, and you do your best to identify the people that has been disappeared and to try to make a measure of justice.
Well, Eduardo Gonzalez and Pierre Crembula, I thank you very much for being with us. We're out of time, unfortunately. An interesting topic, of course, and many unanswered questions. Hope to speak with you again. Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can download selected shows from iTunes. This week, we're featuring 2 podcasts. One, a conversation with Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and another on the slow pace of international aid to Pakistan. On the next Riz Khan show, looking ahead, how will Iraq negotiate its rocky road to political and religious reconciliation as the US officially ends its presence there after 7 years of occupation? Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.